Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, November 27, 2025, and our dear friend Richard Wolff is here with us. Welcome back, Richard.
Thank you very much, Nima. Glad to be here.
Please subscribe and hit like button and follow Richard on his website democracyatwork.info and he on his YouTube channel, the same name, Democracy at Work. You can find many videos he's talking about the economic issues, basically considering the United States and the economy of the United States. Richard, let me start with what has happened with the Trump administration and their proposal. A 28-point plan on the part of the United States was somehow leaked by, it seems that it was Keith Kellogg. But after that, Richard, we had a meeting between the United States on one side and Europeans together with Ukrainians on the other side, talking about the points in Geneva. Marco Rubio went there, and it. How do you see the whole situation with this, with the case of Ukraine? Because after all, it doesn't seem that Europeans, together with Ukrainians, are happy about territorial concessions, the limitation on the military size of Ukraine, and the NATO membership. They don't want to mention that in any sort of settlement in Ukraine. Even they go beyond that. Here is Kaya Kallas talking about how do they feel about the situation with Russia.
That in order, if we want to prevent this war to continue, then actually we should, curb the army of Russia and also their military budget.
Yeah, they're going beyond that, to counter what Russia is talking about. But before going to your comment, here is what was published on on Politico, that Europe thinks the unthinkable retaliation against Russia. They're talking about militarization of Europe, and together with a cyber attack, and getting all coming together in order to counter, to go against Russia. How do you feel about, Richard, the way that Europe is somehow it's so insisting on this failed policy in Ukraine?
Well, I think that the issue is Europe, and I want to start by posing it in a way that is sympathetic to Europe, because part of me is sympathetic to Europe. Now, here's what I mean. For the last 500 years, Europe has been the kind of the center of the world's self-consciousness. In other words, that's where we had the Renaissance, that's where we had the Reformation, that's where we had the French Revolution, which is the great transition from feudalism, which was the dominant system, to capitalism. No sooner does this capitalism arise than it undertakes a global activity that no system before had been able to do, to create a world economy. One of the great contributions of Karl Marx was to say in Capital what I just said, to teach us that capitalism's historic function is to create a world economy, a real world trade system, to bring all the different parts of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so on, into one economic and therefore political and cultural totality. We have that totality today. Europe achieved that. Along the way, it did horrific things, the colonial rape of large parts of the world, horrific, two of the worst world wars we've ever seen in terms of destruction, but they also achieved many breakthroughs, technological, intellectual, you name it. I'm a student of Hegel and Marx and Adam Smith, and look all of that. And now it's over. This is the most important message I can get across. Europe is finished in that role. Europe will be there, Europe will function, Europe can do good things. That's not the issue. But being the center of the world, that's finished. Just as Europe once was just another part of an undifferentiated and not unified globe, Europe will be part of a unified globe, but not one where Europe is the center. And this is very difficult, as it would be for any population, to accept. They are constantly trying not to see what's going on. The demonization of Europe, of Russia, is a childish effort not to see what I just described and to think that your problem is the evil outside force that is threatening you. That's not your problem. Look at the difficulties Russia is having controlling even this little portion, about a quarter of Ukraine. And they're going to invade what? France and Britain and Germany? Is silly. They couldn't, they wouldn't. They're not that stupid. They show very carefully their awareness of these kinds of issues. And the allies, Russia, excuse me, China and India, they rely on, would have no part of any of that. It's it's desperate. It's so desperate, it's transparent. That's why you have to dredge up people, from the Baltic republics with their peculiar history in and out of Russia to scream against Russia, as the right wing there has been doing for a century. This is boring as a proposition. We ought to get over it. It's pure scapegoating. Russia is a convenient alternative for Europe to face the very sad reality that it is a shrinking, decreasingly important part of a large world economy, dominated on the one hand by the rising power of China and the BRICS, who now account for 35% of global output, relative to the United States and the G7, which are shrinking and now account for maybe 27, 28% of the world's output. And that's only getting worse. It's gotten worse, that gap, every year since 2020, when the two crossed, when the total GDP of the G7 was roughly equal to the total GDP of the BRICS at that time. And it's gotten worse and worse. Look, the economic conditions of Europe are very serious. I read this morning that the latest poll in Germany has Mr. Merz getting 23% approval. He only came into power in May. This is half a year and it's gone. And Starmer is in the same situation, and Macron is in the same situation. You know what the GDP growth rate right now is in Britain? 0.1%. You know what that is? That's stagnation. And since their inflation is just shy of 4% per year, you have stagflation, a stagnant economy with rising prices. And a budget just announced that's going to make it worse. So they are pinched and they're squeezed. And then they have this war in Ukraine, which they imagined, which they shouldn't have, but they imagined would be easy to prevail, because it was only Russia on one side and the entire West on the other. Well, it's a lesson in misunderstanding the situation. And, it's only getting worse. So for me, this whole story needs to be contextualized in that. The United States sees the dead end that the Ukraine, for them, represents. They have a different scapegoat. The scapegoat in the United States is immigration. By the way, as it is in many European countries also. But here it's the number one. And maybe the number two is China. But Russia isn't playing that role. And the United States is nowhere near as far down the decline ladder as Europe already is. Europe has been declining for a long time. The last real empire the Europeans had was the British, and that died after World War One and was completely dismembered after World War Two, as history teaches us. So the Europeans are further down the road. They're becoming more and more desperate. Look at the situation. Every major high tech breakthrough is either in Silicon Valley, US, or in China. We all know it. We all see it. That's where the breakthroughs are coming. That's where the investment is robust. Come on. You have to be blind not to see this, or blinded by a need not to see. And for me, these wild statements, we're going to win in Ukraine, the Russians have let us know that they were very upset as NATO moved east. They had been given those promises, not that that's all that important, that it wouldn't happen. Okay, it happened. Shouldn't have been much surprised by it. And it kept happening. But taking Poland back, taking East Germany back, those were countries that really were. But Ukraine was integrated into Russia in a way that other parts of Eastern Europe were not. So it is not so surprising that they eventually made a red line, which was serious. Don't do this. Don't do this. The West did it under the influence of the same mentality you see now. We're going to carve up, we're going to tell the Russians what kind of military they're going to have. That's over. That's not available to you anymore. It's just not. And yes, can you, in your wild desperation, Europe reminds me of a person drowning in the water. I once trained to be a lifeguard, one of those people who stands at the beach and helps anybody who has trouble swimming. And one of the first lessons we were taught is if there's someone out there who's having trouble, you have to approach them in a very particular way from the back, because as they yell and scream going down, they will pull you down with them, especially if they are a big person. So you have to learn the technique. Europe is a flailing decline, and they want to take the world down with them. That's why they can talk in the way you just showed us. Provoke, provoke. Their whole game is what's causing all the tension. They want to pull the United States in to what they are trying to do. And that is turn the decline of Europe around, which is why you will hear when they have a mistaken moment, they're not listening, the microphone is still on. They want to carve Russia up into little small countries so they could eventually what? Counter what's happening in the world. Think about their fantasy. People's utopian dreams tell you much about them. If they could absorb Russia and then separate it from China, well, then you would have a US on one end, a reduced China minus Russia on the other end, and an enlarged Europe now absorbing Russia. That would bring them a nuclear weapon apparatus. That would bring them vast geography, all the oil and gas and cheap energy. You can imagine the excitement. The problem is that's not in the cards. They can't do that. The Russians already see all that. The Chinese see it too. And the Americans, who can't do anything about it either, you know, in all these movements, Europe is too divided. Europe is too far down the ladder to do much about it. So it becomes hysterical. And what you're seeing is the hysterical effort. Mr. Trump tries in his clumsy way to disengage from all of this. Here, Europe, you do it. And the Europeans want to control what happens, but know they don't have the power. They really do know they don't have the power. So either they get the United States in or they lose. So that's what this is about. They could care less about the Ukraine. That's just the game. The issue is hold on to the United States because you are nothing at all without them. And that nothing at all is staring at you in a way that no American administration before Trump was willing to say out loud. Privately here in the United States, I can assure you from personal knowledge that leading political thinkers and policymakers have talked about disengaging from Europe for a long time. They are acutely aware that the balance of benefit and loss has changed. At the end of World War II, you needed allies against communism and the Soviet Union. That's what this was about. And you got that. And you made a deal with Europe. We will give you defense protection, and we will give you a privileged relationship with us. But in exchange, you must be loyal allies politically, and you must turn over your empire to us. And that's what was done. The British, French, all those empires closed down after World War II, and the United States moved in and replaced them. It's very important, people. And what was Europe left? No empire. That was half the wealth flowing into Europe was coming from the empire. That was taken away from them. And they were reduced to being the ally of the United States. And they were given all kinds of benefits and privileges about that. It was a good deal for them. I'm not saying they didn't get from it. They did. They got the Marshall Plan. They were helped to rebuild after World War II. All of that is true. But the United States doesn't need a big buffer against the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union isn't there. If they're going to fight, it's going to be with China, not with Russia. They know that. And they don't want to carry Europe as it declines. That's not attractive. There's nothing that Europe has that they want anymore. It has not the panache. It doesn't have the great, wealth. It doesn't have the fashion. It just doesn't. And therefore, it is not the attractive ally. And then when you get to all of its internal disagreements, they don't. No one wants this. This is not interesting. They don't have any real resources. They are net importers of energy. They are net importers of food and on and on. So it's okay, but it has nothing that it once had. And so I return to my first point. You are watching the decline of Europe. That's what this is. And sure, Mr. Trump comes up with his 28-point plan. And here in the United States, where we have a large part of our mentality also still in the Cold War, that's a slightly different, similar, but different. They're attached not to the long road of declining Europe and civilization. No, they are a political class who is instinctually trained for 70 years in anything coming from the Soviet Union or Russia is bad, 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 bad. That's how they squashed the left. They're very upset now that the left is coming back inside the United States. That's the importance of the election of Zoran Mamdani in New York City, of Bernie Sanders, of Ocasio Cortez, the whole and it's getting bigger literally every day in the United States. I'm sitting here, I can tell you, it's all around me. Never before in my lifetime have I seen this, which means never before in the lifetime of the political leaders of the United States have they had to deal with anything other than Republican and Democrat. Everything else was not there or tiny. That's not true anymore. And the world is changing, and these political people are holding on to the political universe in which they grew up. We don't have in the United States politicians who are also thinking people. It's very rare. Europe used to have much more of that. Now Europe has more like the United States, but we don't have thinking people by and large. And so you won't find it among you will find it among the think tank, the people whose job it is to try to think this through. They are seeing many of these things, but they don't have power yet. A few, but mostly they don't. So what you have is the leftovers, and the leftover cold warriors, sometimes called neocons, same thing, is they sabotage. That's all they can do. Mr. Trump is doing what the mainstream wants to do, and then there's the saboteurs. And one of them leaked the conversation between Witkoff and Lavrov or whoever
Kirill Dmitriev. Yeah.
yeah, so it really it doesn't matter. One way or another, these things are fought out. Now they will try to find who did that, if it was who they suspect, the military guy who advises Trump. They'll throw him out. There'll be another one. This is an ongoing, and everybody knows it. So Mr. Trump makes a deadline. I believe his deadline for the 28-point plan was today, the 27th. That'll come and go like so many others, because this is an ongoing process. And moreover, all of the people participating understand the element of time. Let me stop. I know I'm talking too much, but let me stop with the notion of time, because it'll help people trying to understand this. Time is not the same for all the players here. This is not a game in which there's one unit of time that everybody must observe. So let's start with the Chinese. For them, everything now is relaxed. Why? Because time is on their side. For 30 years, every year, China is a bigger, richer, more powerful player in the world economy. Every year. And every year, Europe goes down relative to China, and the United States falls behind relative to China. When you hear an American talk about China's aggressiveness, that's his need to talk about it that way, but it has nothing to do with it. The Chinese don't need to be aggressive. The US has 700 bases around the world. That's how it replaced all those empires after World War II, by making itself the universal unipower empire. The Chinese simply grow, and that threatens that empire, sure. But the Chinese have one military base. The Americans have 700. Who's aggressive? This is childish once you see it. The Europeans, they have a completely different notion of time. They're in a rush. You actually have that woman, Callas, talking about, why don't we, with enjoyment in her face, control the military of Russia. That's because you're losing the war, sweetie pie. You're not winning, you're losing. You're losing badly. And there's no end to your losing. You were losing before you had that job, and you've been losing across your time in that job, and you will continue to lose. And this is very painful for you, which I understand. But time is her enemy. She's in a rush. She doesn't want Mr. Trump to have more time to carve out a new policy. You want to know what the deep fear in the back of the minds of the Europeans is? It's the following: that the alliance between China and Russia will become even more solid than it already is, that the desperation of the United States in the face of what a Chinese Russian alliance means. And let me be clear with you so everybody understands. The combination of Russia and China puts together the number one manufacturing power in the world, one of the two largest countries by population, 1.4 billion people. Russia, which is the largest country by geography by far, with one of the most developed military apparatuses in the world. You really want to build your future confronting them? This is what's the matter with you? Are you? And the Europeans, if they have half a brain, they can see the Americans looking at this situation. And then what could happen? What might happen if you have a big power, an almost as big power, and a declining third power? The two work out their differences at the expense of the little one. It happens all the time in human history. I'm not saying it will happen that way, but if you want something to be worried about, that would be it. And one of the ways you could have a conflict between China on the one hand and the United States on the other, the rising power, the declining power. One of the ways that might happen is being prefigured by the Ukraine war itself, because that's a proxy war between those two at the expense of the poor people of Ukraine. Look what has happened to them and their country. And what has happened to them and their country could happen to all of Europe. Ha ha! That's the grain of understanding that lies behind the scapegoating. It's not that Russia represents such a threat now, it doesn't, nor in the visible future. But in the back of your mind, as you face semi-consciously the rise of China, the juxtaposition of the United States, what is left for Europe, they realize not much. So you better come up with a plan. They have none. A strategy. I see none. One that involves relating in new ways to the United States on the one hand, but also to Russia and China on the other. They still have enough wealth in Europe. They still have enough after 500 years. They have things to offer. They are wealthy. There's 300 million, roughly, people that are wealthy. Like in the United States, there are 300 million people that are wealthy, relatively speaking. That's a lot. That's something to work with. But you're going to have to wipe out all these leaders. I don't mean, they live. This is not an attack on their lives. But you have to wipe them out of their positions, their political positions, and you have to bring in a new generation of people who understand what I've been trying to say and then want to sit down with the leaders of China and Russia and the leaders of the United States and its allies to work out what Mr. Putin, to his credit, calls a new structure, peaceful structure of security for everybody in the European. He's right. And it doesn't help, blaming him and yelling at him for bad things he's done doesn't change that on that point. It's the only way forward. Otherwise, you're having endless war and conflict and waste of resources in an endless arms race. Seems clear to me.
Yeah. Richard, you've mentioned the Zohran Mamdani winning in New York and how what does it mean politically in the United States. But when you look at the meeting between Donald Trump and Zohran Mamdani, you feel something different because these two were attacking each other before the election. And now, right after that, you see Donald Trump sitting next to Zohran Mamdani, even when the reporter asked Zohran Mamdani if he thinks that Donald Trump is a fascist. Then Donald Trump said, go ahead and say yes, and no problem with that. It shows somehow how the people want to be part of, the winning side.
That's right.
This was the play in Oval Office.
Yeah.
And I think, Richard, this is the crucial point for Europe. If they go in that direction, they're gonna be on the losing side. And that's where the United States would leave them with all the difficulties that they're gonna face in the near future. And do you see any sort of sign that they understand the reality of human being and they understand that this support of the United States being in Europe, supporting Europe, or somehow participating, cooperating with Europe somehow would end because of the reality of what's going on today in the world. Germany is one of the greatest economies in Europe, which was supported, fueled by cheap Russian energy. They have cut that and they have damaged the German economy. They have destroyed the German economy and they're continuing on the same path. I don't know if Germany goes down, how is that going to help Europe in a long run?
It's caught. It can. Let me respond to each of the things you said in turn. You're quite right. The whole point and purpose of meeting Zohran Mamdani and Donald Trump was to enact a very American moment. It's as if what was at stake here was a race between 3 or 4 people who wanted each to be mayor of New York City. And Mr. Trump wants to be a winner. He thinks of himself as a winner. He speaks about himself as a winner. He insists that he has won, even when he obviously hasn't. As in this mayor, he endorsed Mr. Cuomo, who was completely defeated by Mamdani. So he is right up there with the loser. He needs to erase that image. He needs to replace endorsing Cuomo, a big mistake, with being close to the winner. He has to be identified with the winner. I'm working with the winner. I'm a winner. He's a winner. We're all winners. And that's what this is about. He never took the words socialism, fascism. By the way, if you listen to Trump, he uses socialist, communist, fascist as synonyms. They are not differentiated. They are evil, bad people. That's it for him, So he doesn't know what Mamdani is interested in. He doesn't know what Mamdani means by socialism. He's not aware of the varieties of none of it. Right? So it's just about, as you understood, about being with the winner. We're winner. We understand each other. We help each other. We're the winners in this world. That's how he turns the defeat of the election in New York into an asset. And that's smart. What is he going to do? Scream at the guy? It's pointless, right? If he wants to undermine him, which he may do, all that will be done quietly in 100 ways, And then when the moment is good, it'll be public. But that's how this is going to be done. And Zoran Mandani surely knows that. And if he doesn't, he'll learn it soon enough. What's there for Mr. Mandani is a completely different piece of theater. Mandani understands that he is now the number one new socialist in American politics. By winning in New York City, he is more, and being young, he's much more important than Bernie Sanders can be, who's an old senator who comes from a very tiny state, Vermont, that's not part of the rest of the United States, very different. All right. And because it's New York City, it's a bigger position to be mayor than to be a member of Congress the way Ocasio Cortez is. And she's important too, but in a different way. He's now the big reality. So what he has to do is he has to navigate how can he grow and function as a socialist in a hostile environment. What kind of socialism can he advantage and build? What does the very word mean? You know, he's not a communist or anything like that. Even his socialism is very moderate, always was. The Democratic Socialists, which is the name of the group here, is by far the biggest socialist organization in this country now. But one of the reasons is it's so moderate. It's like you were going to say, if you introduce socialism, this is the most acceptable socialism you could possibly want. You know, he's going to put a 2% tax on the super rich. Okay, that leaves them super rich, and it doesn't give him the money to transform the country or anything like, or the city or anything like it. But he can do good things, and he can make careful, and he's good at this, showing the community, look what we're doing here. And because the others, the normal Republican and Democrats, have been so poor at government, have been corrupt, ineffective, he doesn't have to do all that well to do better. I'll give you an example, which is the best he can hope for. For many, many years after World War II, the northern industrial city of Italy, called Bologna, important city. It's not as big as industry as Milano, but almost. It's in that northern part of Italy. It's industrially developed. Bologna was always a red city. The Communist Party of Italy owned that area. They were the mayor all the time. They controlled the city. And one of the things they were very careful to do, no corruption. Everywhere else in Italy was consumed by corruption because the way the country was organized after World War II, the real power was in the Communist Party and the resistance to Mussolini and the Nazis. But the West, the United States, would not let those people govern and gave the government to whoever they could buy to do that. And so the corruption begins right at the beginning and never stops. So to have a clean government in Bologna was such an achievement that the people of Bologna, many of whom were anti-communist because of the ideology of the Cold War, they always voted for the communist anyway. And if you ask them why, no corruption. Okay? He can do that. Mr. Mamdani, I don't know if he will, but he can do that. And if he does that, it will be a very, very smart way to build the socialism. There are now socialists all over the United States who've always been there. I want to remind your audience, if they don't know, that before World War II, before the Cold War that begins in 1945, socialists and communists were all over the United States. We have had hundreds of mayors of American cities that were socialist. Mr. Mamdani is not the first, not at all. We've had state legislatures full of elected socialists and some communists also. It was That's one of the reasons why in World War II the United States was allied with the Soviet Union. It's only after that, the sudden reversal right after World War II, when the United States turned against its ally, the Soviet Union, and realized that it had two problems here. Number one, the growth of communism supported by the Soviet Union globally, and then the power of communists and socialists who had become much more powerful during the Great Depression of the 1930s. So, how did you deal with these two threats to American capitalism? You went on a war, an anti communist crusade, which allowed you to destroy the socialists and communists inside the country, which they did, and to justify replacing the European empires around the world by saying we're bringing democracy and liberty, instead of the old colonial horror. This ideological, to this day, has people still thinking like that because it was a perfect ideological cover for what the United States had to do in its own mind. And it was successful. You destroyed socialism. And so what you're seeing with Mamdani, it's just coming back. All those people are still there. Even if they've died, they gave those ideas to their children. Those ideas, and so socialists all over America, they find me and I talk to them. It's part of my job, and they're everywhere wondering, ooh, if Mr. Mamdani can do what he did in New York, and they're not Muslims. So for them, it's just a socialism, but you can be a Protestant or a Catholic or a Jew without the extra burden of a Muslim. If a Muslim can do it in a city that has more Jews than any other city in the United States, well, you're learning that socialism is acceptable. Bernie showed it. Ocasio-Cortez shows it, and now he shows it. You're going to see more and more of that. You could even see, I don't know if you caught this, Nima, there was a moment when Mr. Trump was denouncing Mamdani, when he said, he is a socialist. And then Trump corrected himself. He said, no. He said, not a socialist. He's a communist. That's the recognition of Mr. Trump, the president, that calling someone a socialist doesn't do the work it once did. The world is changing, and even he is getting it. That's what's going on now. And in all of this, the Europeans, I end today where I began. It is very, very sad. But you're not going to deal with your problem, your decline, your loss of the position in the world you had for 500 years. And remember, you didn't lose that position because of what others are doing to you. You lost that position because the way you worked in that position undermines itself. Remember one of your greatest thinkers, right? Hegel. Everything is internally contradictory. You became rich and powerful with your colonial empire, but you also built your own grave diggers. You built the institution that now displaces you. That's the way life goes. You grow up, you have children, and then you pass away, and your children take over. Painful, but it is the reality. And Europe is watching it now. My only plea, and I really say this as someone, I think I told you, my father was French, my mother German. I speak French and German. I was born in the United States, lived and worked here all my life, but my half of me is still European. I don't want Europe to disappear. I don't want Europe to decline. But having the kind of leadership they have now, which wants to go to war by demonizing Putin, because they don't have a Stalin, they transform Mr. Putin into one, that doesn't solve anything. That is a desperate act of somebody drowning. You'd be much better off with leaders who want to sit down and work something out. I have to tell you, in that regard, Mr. Trump, with all his horrible faults, is ahead of them. And that must bother them on some level also.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Richard, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Yeah, very interesting. And thank you for your program and for making sure that people around the world get to hear something a little different from what's in the newspaper each morning.
Yeah, exactly. Great pleasure.
Bye bye.
See you.